wind moves like a whisper through the ruins of Thebes, carrying grains of sand that have seen too much. Beneath those golden dunes lie bones, nameless, unmarked, forgotten. They belong to women whose cries were once swallowed by the desert, whose pain was never carved into stone. Ancient Egypt, a civilization celebrated for its art, its gods, and its monuments, also perfected something far darker, the ritual of suffering. In a world where the pharaoh was divine and the social order sacred, there existed no mercy for those born into bondage. Female slaves were not seen as people. They were tools, spoils of conquest, tokens of trade, bodies to be owned and broken. Behind the gold masks of kings and the marble of temples, the reality was far more human, far more brutal. These women came from Nubia, from Canaan, from the conquered corners of empires. Torn from their homes, they were branded as property, forced to serve mistresses, priests, and pharaohs alike. Some labored in the heat of the fields, their backs scarred by the overseer's whip. Others served in the dim chambers of the palace, their punishment hidden behind curtains of silk. And yet, Egypt remembered them, not in words, but in silence. The silence of bones unearthed in workers' graves. The silence of hieroglyphs that speak of defiled ones, punished without name. Archaeologists find traces of their existence, yet never their stories. The sands may have buried their screams, but not their truth. For in every dynasty, in every reign, power had its victims, and in Egypt, that power was eternal. The monuments we admire today were built not only by brilliance and devotion, but by fear and submission. These women, voiceless and invisible, carried the weight of a civilization that worshipped gods, yet forgot compassion. But what were their crimes? Sometimes disobedience, sometimes merely existing in the wrong body, the wrong class, the wrong fate. Their torment was justified as divine order, their pain sanctified by the gods themselves. And as the desert wind continues to whisper through broken stones, one question lingers: how much blood was buried beneath the beauty of Egypt's golden age? The answer begins with understanding what it meant to be owned, to be the property of the pharaoh. To be born a slave in ancient Egypt was to be born into silence, a life without a name, a lineage, or a voice. But for women, that silence was deeper, heavier, and absolute. They were not just slaves, they were possessions, extensions of their master's power and desire, absorbed into a system that called itself divine order. The pharaoh was believed to be a god on earth, the living embodiment of Horus. Everything beneath him existed to serve, from the high priests in their sacred robes to the nameless women who swept his palace floors. In the language of the law, a female slave was not considered a person but a thing. She could be traded, beaten, gifted, or killed without consequence. Her worth was measured only by her usefulness. Many of these women were prisoners of war, captured from Nubia, Libya, Syria, and Canaan. Some were given to temples as offerings, others to noble households as domestic workers or concubines. The most beautiful were sent to the royal palace, where their bodies became both symbols of status and instruments of control. There was no freedom, only degrees of servitude. The Egyptian elite justified this cruelty with the belief in Ma'at, the sacred balance of the universe. Every being had its place, and to defy that place was to invite chaos. Thus, the enslavement of women, their punishment, even their deaths, were seen not as sins, but as the preservation of order. The pharaoh ruled as the god's voice. His word was law, his pleasure sacred, his wrath divine. Inside the palaces, the contrast was striking. The walls glittered with gold and lapis lazuli, yet the corridors echoed with fear. Female slaves lived at the mercy of their mistresses, whose jealousy could be fatal. A dropped cup, a wrong glance, a whispered rumor, all could end in torment. The higher one rose in favor, the more precarious the fall became. Race and beauty determined much. Lighter-skinned slaves from the north were prized for palace service, while darker-skinned women from Nubia were often relegated to the fields or labor camps. The hieroglyphs that survive depict them kneeling, bound, carrying baskets of grain, their heads bowed before masters who smiled under crowns of gold. Yet even in their suffering, these women sustained Egypt's illusion of perfection. They wove the pharaoh's linens, bore the noblemen's children, tended the temples, and polished the very statues that represented their oppressors as gods. Without their invisible labor, the empire's splendor would have crumbled into dust. They were the foundation beneath the throne, unseen, unacknowledged, indispensable. But in a world that glorified control, even the faintest act of defiance had to be crushed, and crushed publicly. Because in ancient Egypt, punishment was never private. It was a warning, a spectacle, a message written in pain. And so the sands soon learned to echo with screams, in the age of punishment as spectacle. In the searing heat of an Egyptian afternoon, punishment was not hidden, it was displayed. The courtyard of a noble's estate could transform into a theater of pain, where slaves became unwilling actors in a ritual of dominance. For the masters, it was justice. For the gods, purification. But for the women who suffered, it was hell under the open sky. Ancient Egypt was a society obsessed with order, and punishment was its most visible language. Every lash of the whip, every drop of blood was meant to remind others of their place. Female slaves in particular bore the brunt of this spectacle because their bodies were seen as both tools and temptations. To control them was to assert divine authority. To humiliate them was to reassert the balance of Ma'at. Historical records and fragments of papyri speak of brutal customs. Women beaten until their backs split open, branded with the marks of ownership, or mutilated for disobedience. The overseer's whip, often made from the hide of a hippopotamus, tore through skin with sickening precision. Each strike was delivered not merely to inflict pain, but to restore power. The masters watched, sometimes in silence, sometimes chanting prayers to the gods, as if holiness could sanctify cruelty. There were punishments for every transgression. A slave who spoke back could have her tongue cut out. One accused of theft might lose a hand. Those who dared to run, or were merely suspected of trying, were branded on the face, a permanent reminder of their rebellion. But the worst punishments were reserved for the women who violated the boundaries of purity, those accused of seducing their masters, or of defiling the pharaoh's property. In one account found in the Wilbauer Papyrus, a female servant was accused of impurity within the sacred household. The record doesn't specify her crime, only the sentence: public flogging followed by exposure to the desert sun. Left tied to a post, her body became an offering to the sand and wind, her death a warning. The text ends coldly, order restored. Even temples were not free from this darkness. Inscriptions show priests overseeing the punishment of defiled ones, women who entered sacred chambers without permission or touched relics reserved for the gods. These punishments were performed before the temple gates, witnessed by others who bowed in fear. Pain, in these moments, was transformed into a spectacle of divine authority. Archaeological evidence supports these grim accounts. Excavations near the Valley of the Kings have revealed skeletal remains bearing deep scars on wrists and ankles, signs of binding and restraint. Some skulls show fractures consistent with blunt trauma. Others display deliberate cuts along the back, where flesh had been flayed away. These were not the injuries of war, but of punishment. And yet, the cruelty was not random. It followed a ritual rhythm, one that blended justice with performance. When a woman was punished, she was stripped of her humanity, reduced to an emblem of fear. The crowd's silence was part of the ritual. It magnified her isolation. Every cry was meant to echo into obedience. There was also spectacle and mercy. When masters pretended to forgive, it was only to heighten control. Some punishments ended not in death, but in disfigurement, ensuring the victim's suffering would serve as a living reminder. To exist, mutilated but alive, was itself a punishment, a sentence without end. This was the paradox of Egyptian civilization. It built monuments to eternity, but used human bodies as its foundation stones. The temples that promised immortality were erected through mortal agony, and sometimes that agony wasn't just punishment, it was sacrifice. Because when the pharaoh's priests said the gods demanded blood, it was often the blood of women. There are places in Egypt where the air itself feels heavy, where the stones seem to breathe secrets. Deep beneath temple floors, archaeologists have found narrow chambers sealed for millennia. Inside, they uncovered bones, delicate, feminine, and marked by violence. Some were bound at the wrists, others bore shallow knife cuts along the ribs and spine. The official inscriptions nearby spoke of offerings to appease the gods. But the evidence tells a darker story. These were not offerings of gold or grain. These were women. In a world where the pharaoh ruled as divine intermediary, every drought, every flood, every omen demanded an answer, and often that answer was blood. The concept of ritual sacrifice was not unique to Egypt, but in its rarest, most secret form, it was reserved for purification. Female slaves, being considered impure yet sacred in their suffering, became vessels for these rites. Their deaths, it was believed, could cleanse a sin, seal a curse, or bring favor from the gods. Some scholars point to inscriptions from the Middle Kingdom that describe the chosen one who walks into the silence. This phrase, poetic and chilling, refers to those led into hidden sanctuaries, never to return. There, beneath the gaze of priests and flickering oil lamps, the ritual began. The woman would be bathed in sacred oils, her hair combed, her skin painted with ochre. She was dressed not as a slave but as an offering, a living gift. The priests would chant hymns invoking Osiris, Anubis, and Sekhmet, the goddess of both healing and destruction. As the drums echoed through the chamber, the line between prayer and execution blurred. The woman's breath became part of the ceremony, her heartbeat a rhythm beneath the chanting. Then came the blade, precise, ritualistic, deliberate. Some were suffocated, others cut, their blood collected in alabaster bowls as the priests proclaimed renewal. The remains tell their own truth. Skeletons unearthed in Abydos and Saqqara show ritualistic markings, shallow incisions that suggest ceremonial killing rather than mere torture. One grave contained a woman buried with fragments of faience jewelry, her body placed beside offerings of food and amulets, an unsettling gesture of reverence for a victim treated as divine property. These rituals were cloaked in holiness, yet built on horror. For the pharaoh's court, such sacrifices symbolized balance, but for the women, they were annihilation disguised as worship. They died in silence so that Egypt could claim harmony. And because no record could ever admit the blood of slaves sanctified the gods, their stories remained trapped in the earth. Occasionally, the silence cracked. In a papyrus fragment known as the Hymn of the Cleansed, a priest laments that the cries of the offering reached the heavens. Was it guilt or fear that the gods themselves might weep at the sound? The line ends abruptly, as if someone had ordered the words erased. These women's deaths were more than punishment. They were instruments of belief. Their agony became the invisible mortar binding Egypt's faith and fear. And as centuries passed, temples fell, gods faded, and sands covered the tombs. But the echoes of those chambers remained. Even today, when the archaeologists' torches pierce the darkness of a newly opened vault, the silence feels alive, as if it remembers. The air seems to whisper of prayers spoken over screams, of tears mixed with sacred oils. For not all slaves were beaten or sacrificed in the open. Some lived surrounded by beauty, silks, perfumes, jewels, yet were prisoners all the same. Their chains shimmered in gold. Not every slave bore whip marks. Some wore perfume, some slept on linen sheets beside gilded lamps. But comfort in ancient Egypt could be its own kind of cage. For the women closest to power, the pharaoh's attendants, the royal concubines, the handmaidens of queens, luxury was merely a softer form of control. Their smiles were rehearsed, their steps measured, their every glance monitored by unseen eyes. In the royal harem, beauty was both weapon and sentence. The pharaoh's concubines were chosen for their faces, their grace, their ability to please the divine ruler. They were dressed in fine linen, adorned with gold, fed from silver plates, yet not one of them was free. Their existence depended on favor, and favor could vanish with a whisper. A jealous queen, a suspicious priest, a political rival, any could condemn them with a single accusation: betrayal, impurity, witchcraft. Punishment within the palace rarely left blood on the marble floors. Instead, it worked in silence. A favored woman might awaken one morning to find her jewelry gone, her attendants dismissed, her chamber door locked. Days later, her name would be erased from palace records, her belongings distributed, her fate unspoken. Sometimes she was sent to the lower servants' quarters, her beauty stripped of meaning. Sometimes she was quietly executed, by poison, by strangulation, or by the slow torture of isolation. Even survival was agony. Those who remained were forced to compete for affection, turning against one another in a web of envy and deceit. The pharaoh's pleasure was unpredictable. A blessing one night, a curse the next. A single frown could mean exile. A misplaced word could mean disappearance. The women learned to read moods like scripture, to smile through humiliation, to mourn each vanished companion in silence. Their chains were woven from gold, their prisons perfumed with lotus and myrrh, and yet the fear beneath the fragrance was constant. One ancient letter from a servant in the royal court describes how the women of the inner chambers do not sleep, for dreams bring omens, and omens bring death. It was the cruelest illusion of all, the appearance of privilege masking the reality of enslavement. These women existed in the fragile space between desire and danger, adored and destroyed by the same hands. To the outside world, they lived among splendor, but behind the carved doors of the palace, they were as trapped as those who toiled in the fields. Only their chains glistened in the torchlight. And when dynasties crumbled and the last pharaoh's crown turned to dust, their stories dissolved into silence once more. Yet the echoes of their suffering, the whispers of silk and sorrow, never fully faded. Because the chains of the past have a way of surviving, reshaped but never broken. And so the story ends where it began, with echoes that still haunt the sands. Time buried their names, but not their pain. Beneath the ruins of palaces and temples, the bones of forgotten women still whisper stories the hieroglyphs refuse to tell. Egypt's empires have fallen, its gods silenced, yet the suffering that built their glory remains etched into the land, in the dust, in the stone, in the silence. Every civilization leaves behind a legacy. Egypt left monuments of grandeur, but also invisible graves. For every golden mask unearthed, there are countless faces that will never be seen again. Women who lived and died unseen, erased by the very hands they served. Their agony fed the myths of eternity. Their blood sustained a kingdom that worshipped order but thrived on cruelty. The curse they left behind was not written in magic or carved in tombs. It was the curse of remembrance, that history, however it tries to hide, cannot bury truth forever. When the archaeologist's brush touches bone, when the wind moves through the desert ruins, something stirs, a voice that demands to be heard. Their chains may have turned to dust, but their echoes linger. In every story of exploitation, every system that values beauty over freedom, obedience over humanity. The faces change, the empires change, but the silence feels the same, and so the sands still remember the screams. They remember what power tried to erase. Because the cruelest truth of all is this: civilizations rise and fall, but the suffering of the forgotten never truly dies.